A man removes bear trap in the woods. What the bear does next will amaze you. They say some moments in life change everything for one elderly man living alone in the remote Montana wilderness. That moment came on a cold autumn morning. A desperate cry from the forest pulled him into an unforgettable encounter. A wounded black bear, helpless and trapped, staring at him with eyes that seemed to plead for help. What followed was an extraordinary connection that blurred the lines between human and animal, leading to a story so unbelievable it left an entire community in awe. What would you do if nature itself reached out for your kindness, and how could one act of compassion ripple into a legacy that touched countless lives? Stay tuned, because this story is about to show you the incredible power of trust, courage, and the unexpected bonds that unite us all. The morning sun barely pierced through the dense fog that blanketed the Montana wilderness. John Garrett, a 72-year-old widower, sat on the porch of his modest cabin, cradling a mug of coffee in his weathered hands. The steam from the cup swirled into the crisp autumn air, a fleeting reminder of warmth amid the encroaching chill around him. The forest was alive with the subtle whispers of nature, the rustling leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft gurgle of Miller's Creek nearby. For the past decade, this cabin had been John's refuge, a place where he sought solace after losing his beloved wife Margaret. Her photograph rested on the wooden porch rail, her serene smile a constant companion. Kindness, John, she used to say, her voice soft and unwavering. It's the pebble that ripples through the pond of life. He sipped his coffee inside. The mornings had become predictable, solitary, but peaceful. That peace was shattered by a sound he'd never forget, a mournful cry, low and guttural, that echoed through the forest. John fro his senses heightened. It was a mix of pain and desperation, and otherworldly moan that tugged at something deep inside him. Setting his mug down, John grabbed his old flashlight and field kit. The sun had yet to fully rise, and the mist hung thick among the towering pines. As he ventured into the forest, the cries grew louder, leading him toward Miller's Creek, a place he often visited for its tranquility. Today, it was anything but tranquil. Through the thinning mist, John saw her, a black bear, her massive form twisted unnaturally. She lay near the creek, her front paw caught in a rusted metal trap, the cruel kind that had been outlawed years ago. The sight hit him like a blow to the chest. Her eyes, wide and frantic, locked onto his, filled with a mix of fear and pain. Dear God, John whispered, his voice cracking. Who could do such a thing? The bear let out another cry, weaker this time, as though pleading for help. Most people would have turned back, called the rangers, or kept their distance, but John wasn't most people. Decades in the wilderness had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him this creature needed him. He approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing tone. Easy there, girl, I'm not here to hurt you. The bear's thrashing subsided slightly, her breaths labored. JN set his kit down and opened it, the clinking of tools echoing in the quiet forest. He knew this was dangerous. Wild animals, especially ones in pain, were unpredictable, but he also saw something in her eyes, a spark of understanding, or perhaps hope. This is going to hurt a little, he murmured, crouching low. His hands trembled as he worked to disable the trap's mechanism. The bear flinched but stayed still, as if sensing his intentions. Minutes felt like hours as he struggled with the rusted device. Finally, with a groan of metal, the jaws of the trap released. The bear yanked her paw free, staggering back a few steps. John immediately moved away, giving her space. He watched as she inspected her injured paw, her movements slow and deliberate. Then, to his astonishment, she turned toward him, her gaze steady. She limped closer, her massive frame looming over the old man, and gently nudged his hand with her nose. The gesture was brief, but it left John frozen in place, tears welling in his eyes. You're welcome, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Without another sound, the bear retreated into the mist, her form disappearing among the trees. John stood there for a long time, staring after her, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He'd helped her, but it felt like she'd give him something far greater, a connection, a Reminder that kindness even toward a wild creature could bridge the deepest divides. As he packed up his tools and turned back toward the cabin, John noticed something in the mud's smaller paw prints, trailing alongside the larger one's cubs. He realized somewhere out there she had a family depending on her. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he made his way home. Unbeknownst to John, this act of compassion was the first step in a journey that would reshape not only his life but the lives of everyone in the mountain community. And as the sun finally broke through the mist, its golden light painted the forest with a warmth that felt almost like a blessing. 3 days had passed since John freed the black bear from the cruel trap. The memory of that morning lingered with him, vivid and unshakable. He couldn't help but wonder if she was healing, if her paw was mending, and if she'd found her way back to her cubs. As the sun began its slow ascent over the Montana wilderness, John sipped his morning coffee on the porch, the warmth of the mug a small comfort against the autumn chill. He glanced at Margaret's photograph resting on the rail, her gentle smile offering silent encouragement. She's probably back with her family, he said aloud, as though Margaret might answer. At least, I hope she is. The thought brought a small measure of peace, but John's solitude was short-lived. A rustling sound broke through the stillness, drawing his attention to the edge of the forest. His heart quickened as he spotted movement in the undergrowth. Squinting against the morning light, he saw her, the black bear, emerging from the trees. Maya, he muttered the name slipping from his lips unbidden. The bear moved cautiously, her injured paw still held close to her chest, but showing signs of hiding behind her. Two small cubs tumbled into view, their playful movements a stark contrast to their mother's deliberate steps. John set his coffee down slowly, his pulse racing. Well, I'll be, he murmured. You came back. The bear paused about 30 feet from the porch, her intelligent eyes locking with his. For a moment neither moved, a silent understanding passing between them. Then, to John's astonishment, she stepped forward and dropped something from her mouth onto the ground, a freshly caught fish. She nudged it toward him before retreating a few paces, her cubs darting behind her legs. John's throat tightened as emotion welled up inside him. A thank you gift, he whispered, his voice thick. He rose slowly, careful not to startle them, and took a step closer. You didn't have to do that, girl, but thank you. Maya let out a soft chuffing sound, low and guttural, that seemed almost conversational. Her cubs peeked out from behind her, their curious eyes fixed on the man standing before them. One of them ventured a step forward, sniffing the air before retreating to its mother's side. Johann chuckled softly. They're bold, just like you. For the next hour he sat on the porch, barely moving, watching the bear family go about their morning. The cubs wrestled in the grass, their tiny growls punctuated by squeals of delight. Maya kept a watchful eye on them and occasionally glanced back at John, as if making sure he was still there. It was a moment John would remember for the rest of his life, an unspoken truce between man and beast, born from a single act of compassion. As the sun climbed higher, Maya stood and gave a low grunt, signaling her cubs to follow. They scampered after her as she turned back toward the forest. But before disappearing into the trees, Maya paused and looked back at JN1. Last time he raised a hand in farewell, a small smile on his lips. Take care of them, he said softly, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. And yourself. When the forest finally swallowed her silhouette, John exhaled a breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding the stillness of the wilderness returned, but it felt different now, as if the encounter had shifted something within him. Later that afternoon, as he sat by the fire, John's thoughts drifted back to the bear, the gesture she'd made, the gift she'd brought. It was more than instinct, he was sure of it. There had been intention, a deliberate choice to show gratitude. He reached for his journal, an old leather-bound book Margaret had given him years ago, and began to write. October 15th. Today Maya returned. She brought her cubs and left a fish as a thank you. It's strange, but I felt something more in her actions, something almost human. I don't know what this means, but I'm certain it's the beginning of something I don't yet understand. Setting the journal aside, John stared into the crackling fire outside. The wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the sounds of the wilderness. He felt a faint stirring of hope, a feeling he hadn't known in years. As the shadows lengthened and the stars began to dot the sky, John couldn't shake the sense that his connection to Maya was only just beginning. What had started as a chance encounter was growing into something extraordinary, something that would ripple far beyond the quiet confines of his mountain home. The early days of November swept through Montana with an unforgiving chill. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of John's windows, and the forest seemed quieter than usual, as though holding its breath in anticipation of the winter storm predicted to arrive later that week. The forecast called for record-breaking snowfall and bitter cold, a blizzard unlike anything the region had seen in decades. John prepared as he always did, stocking up on firewood, filling the cabin with non-perishable food, and double-checking the seals on his windows and doors. He worked methodically, his movements slower than they used to be, but steady at 72. His joints ached in the cold, and the effort left him more fatigued than he cared to admit. On the evening before the storm was set to arrive, John sat by the fireplace with a steaming mug of pine needle tea, a remedy Margaret had sworn by for his arthritis. Her photo rested on the mantel, the flickering firelight dancing across her face. Looks like it's going to be a rough one, he murmured, addressing the photo as if she could hear him. Wish you were here to tell me I'm overthinking it. The wind outside began to pick up, howling faintly through the cracks. John shivered despite the warmth of the fire and decided to head to bed early. As he extinguished the lamps and climbed under the heavy quilt, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was stirring in the woods beyond his cabin. The storm hit with a vengeance the next day. Snow piled up faster than John had ever seen, burying his porch steps within hours and leaving the forest shrouded in a white, impenetrable haze. The wind screamed, relentlessly rattling the cabin walls and whistling through the chimney. Even with the fire roaring, the cold crept into the corners of the room. By evening, John felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping a bowl of broth and listening to the storm's fury. His thoughts wandered to Maya and her cubs. Were they safe? Had she found shelter in some hidden den? He hoped so, though the worrying lingered like a stubborn shadow. The answer came sooner than he expected. A sudden frantic scratching at the door made John freeze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. The sound was urgent, insistent, and unmistakably not the wind. He pushed back his chair and grabbed the flashlight hanging by the door. Peering through the frosted window, he saw a massive shape huddled against the storm. Maya, he whispered, his heart lurching. He opened the door to find the bear standing there, her dark fur dusted with snow. Her eyes were wide, her movements frantic. She pawed at his leg, letting out a series of guttural sounds that were almost like cries. What is it, girl? John asked, already reaching for his coat and boots. What's wrong? Maya stepped back, turned toward the woods, and looked at him expectantly. It was clear she wanted him to follow, despite every survival instinct screaming at him to stay in. Inside, John grabbed his emergency pack and flashlight and stepped into the storm. The snow was blinding, the wind cutting through his coat like icy blades. Maya moved ahead, her massive frame breaking a path through the drifts. She looked back frequently to make sure John was keeping up. They trudged through the snow for what felt like an eternity, the biting cold numbing his hands and face. Finally, Maya stopped near the edge of a steep ravine. John's flashlight illuminated a narrow crevice below, partially buried in snow. His breath caught as he spotted two small shapes huddled together, Maya's cubs, but his heart nearly stopped when the beam of light revealed a human hand sticking out from the snow near them. Oh, dear God, he whispered, dropping to his knees. Kids. John scrambled into the crevice, the snow biting at his hands as he dug frantically. Within moments, he uncovered two children, a boy and a girl. No older than 8 or 9, they were unconscious but breathing, their bodies curled up with Maya's cubs for warmth. John recognized them immediately as the Anderson children from a cabin a few miles away they must have gotten lost in the storm, you incredible girl, JN said, his voice breaking as he glanced up at Maya. You found them. Maya let out a low grunt and began clearing snow with her powerful paws, careful not to harm the children or her cubs. With her help, John freed the small bodies and wrapped them in the emergency blankets from his pack. He tucked one of the cubs under each child's arm for added warmth. Weck never make it to their cabin in this storm, Johan muttered, shaking his head. They'll have to come to mine. Maya seemed to understand. She scooped up one of her cubs in her jaws and began leading the way back through the blizzard. John followed, carrying the children one over each shoulder while the remaining cub clung tightly to his chest, tucked inside his coat. When they finally reached the cabin, John's strength was nearly spent, but the sight of the fire's glow through the window renewed his resolve. Inside, he laid the children near the hearth and began the careful process of warming them. Maya and her cubs stayed close, their presence a comfort in the otherwise harrowing moment. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin the warmth of the fire and the gentle sounds of the Bear family created an atmosphere of fragile hope. Maya lay beside the children, her massive body radiating heat, while her cubs nuzzled the small humans as though they were part of their own family. As dawn broke, the storm began to ease. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, illuminating a scene John would never forget. The little girl stirred first, her eyes fluttering open. She stared at Maya for a long moment before reaching out to touch the bear's nose. You saved us, she whispered, her voice barely audible. That she did, Johan said, his voice thick with emotion. That she did. For the first time in years, John felt the weight of Margaret's words as though she were standing beside him. Kindness, John. It's the pebble that ripples through the pond of life, and in that moment he realized the truth of it. The morning after the storm was one of quiet awe. The wind had died down, leaving the world blanketed in an undisturbed layer of snow glittering under the pale sunlight. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire had chased away the night's chill, but the events of the blizzard lingered heavily in the air. John knelt by the hearth, checking on the Anderson children. The boy Jake stirred first, blinking groggy as he adjusted to the unfamiliar surroundings. His younger sister Emily nestled close beside him, still half asleep. Maya and her cubs remained nearby, their massive forms a strange yet comforting presence. Where are we? Jake coaxed, his voice raspy from the cold. You're safe, Johan said, softly offering him a warm cup of broth. You got caught in the storm, but your angel bear here brought you to me. Jake's gaze shifted to Maya, who lay protectively near the children, her dark eyes watching him with calm intelligence. She saved us, he whispered, his small hand reaching out tentatively toward her. Maya didn't move, allowing the boy's fingers to brush her fur. Emily, now fully awake, followed suit, her tiny hand resting gently on one of the cubs curled beside her. The angel bear, Emily said with wonder, her voice tinged with reverence. She kept us warm, and then she found you. John smiled, his heart swelling with emotion. That's right, she did. As the morning wore on, the cabin filled with activity. Johan prepared hot cocoa for the children, using the last of his supplies, while Maya and her cubs watched from a respectful distance. The bond between the children and the bears was unmistakable, forged in the life or death crucible of the storm. Jake and Emily showed no fear, only gratitude and admiration. By mid-morning, the distant hum of helicopter blades broke the serene silence. John stepped onto the porch, shielding his eyes against the bright glare of sunlight reflecting off the snow. The sound grew louder until a rescue team appeared on the horizon, descending carefully into the clearing near his cabin. When the search party arrived, led by John Anderson, the children's father, and two forest rangers, the scene inside the cabin left them stunned. There by the fire sat the two missing children, their hands resting on the fur of a black bear, and her cubs as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Emily, Jake, John Anderson shouted, rushing inside with tears streaming down his face. The children leapt to their feet and ran to their father's arms. Daddy, they cried in unison, their voices filled with relief. Anderson held them tightly, his shoulders shaking. With sobs, "I thought I lost you," he murmured. How did you survive out there?" "It was the angel bear," Emily said, turning to point at Mia. "She found us, kept us warm, and then brought us here." The forest rangers froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their tranquilizer guns, but John Garrett quickly stepped between them and the bear. "Put those down," he said firmly. "This bear's the reason those kids are alive. She's earned her right to leave here." Peacefully, the lead ranger hesitated, his hand still on the gun. "John, it's a wild animal. We can't just do nothing to harm her." John interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. "She's not just a wild animal, she's family." Maya seemed to sense the tension. She rose slowly, her cubs gathering at her side. The children watched with wide eyes as the bear moved toward the door. She paused briefly, turning to look at John. With those intelligent, knowing eyes, he nodded at once. A silent goodbye. "Go on, girl," he said softly. "You've done more than enough with that." Maya and her cubs slipped out into the snow, disappearing into the forest. The cabin fell silent, the enormity of what had just happened settling over everyone like a thick blanket. In the days that followed, the story of the angel bear spread like wildfire through the small mountain community. Margaret Chen, the owner of the local general store, recounted her delivery to John's cabin when she'd seen the bear family for herself. Her article in the town paper captured the hearts of residents, describing not just the miraculous rescue, but also the months of quiet visits and the trust built between man and beast. "What's truly remarkable," Margaret wrote, "is not just the bear's actions, but the connection between her and John Garrett. It's a story of kindness transcending boundaries, a reminder that compassion can bridge even the deepest divides." The story didn't stop there. News outlets picked it up, and soon reporters from across the state descended upon the small town, eager to meet the man behind the incredible tale. Wildlife behaviorists, including a renowned researcher named Dr. Grace Bennett, traveled to the region to study what they called an unprecedented example of human-animal interaction. Dr. Bennett met with John on a chilly November morning, her curiosity palpable. "Mr. Garrett," she began, notebook in hand, "in all my years of studying wildlife, I've never encountered anything like this. What do you think made the bear trust you?" John smiled, his gaze drifting to the woods beyond his porch. "It wasn't about trust at first," he said thoughtfully. "It was about kindness. When you give it freely, it has a way of coming back to you." Dr. Bennett noted, jotting down his words. "And you believe this act of kindness is what led her to bring the children to you?" "I don't just believe it," John said, his voice steady. "I know it." As winter deepened, the community began to change. Reports of illegal traps and poaching in the area dwindled to nothing. Inspired by the story of the angel bear, locals took up conservation efforts, creating safe zones for wildlife and organizing educational events about coexistence. The Anderson children, profoundly affected by their experience, started a wildlife preservation club at their school, aptly named Friends of the Forest. They often visited Johan, bringing treats for Maya and her cubs, hoping to catch another glimpse of the family that had saved their lives. For John, the ripple effects of that single act of compassion were a testament to Margaret's enduring wisdom. Each morning, as he sipped his coffee and watched the forest awaken, he felt her presence more strongly than ever. "You were right, Margaret," he whispered one day, gazing at her photograph. "Kindness really is the pebble, and the ripples, they're bigger than I ever imagined." Unbeknownst to him, the ripples were only just beginning. Winter's grip on the mountain loosened. As the weeks turned 2 months, the snow melted, revealing a transformed wilderness. The forest, once silent under its icy blanket, now buzzed with new life. Birds chirped, streams bubbled with vigor, and the sun warmed the earth, coaxing fresh shoots from the ground. For John Garrett, spring brought more than just the thaw. It brought visitors word of his bond with the angel bear had spread far and wide, drawing curious onlookers, reporters, and conservationists to his humble cabin. Some came with skepticism, others with reverence, but all left touched by the Story on one particular utterly crisp April morning. John sat in his rocking chair, his trusty mug of coffee in hand. His porch had become a gathering spot for visitors, and today was no exception. Among the group were children from the Anderson family's wildlife club there, bright eyes eager for stories, and Dr. Grace Bennett, who had returned to study the remarkable bear. Mr. Garrett asked a young girl, her hand shooting up with urgency, "Do you think the angel bear will come back?" John smiled, adjusting Margaret's photograph on the porch railing. "Maybe not today, but she be back. She has her own life to live out there, but bears don't forget, and neither should we." The girl's eyes widened and she whispered to her friend, "I hope I get to see her one day." Later that afternoon, as the children explored the woods under the watchful eyes of their parents, Dr. Bennett sat beside John on the porch, a notebook back balanced on her knee. "John," she began, her tone serious, "you've sparked something here. The story of Maya, the angel bear, isn't just inspiring people, it's changing how we think about wildlife conservation. Her actions and the connection you built are rewriting what we know about animal behavior." JN leaned back, gazing at the forest's edge. "I didn't set out to change anything, Doc. I just did what felt right." Dr. Bennett nodded. Sometimes that's all it takes, a single act of kindness. But this is more than that. The Anderson children, the community, the new wildlife preservation laws being proposed. Your story has created ripples far beyond this mountain. The following week, a meeting was held in the town hall. Spurred by Maya's story, the local community had drafted a proposal for new wildlife protections. It included stricter penalties for poaching, designated safe zones for bears and other animals, and educational programs for residents and visitors. When JN was asked to speak, he initially hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his strength, but as he looked out at the gathered crowd, many of them children who had been touched by his story, he felt a sense of responsibility. "Folks," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "this isn't about me. It's not even just about Maya, though. She's taught us more than I could put into words. This is about what kind of neighbors we want to be, not just to each other, but to the creatures we share this land with." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Kindness isn't just something we do when it's easy. It's what we do when it's hard, when it's risky, when we don't know what the outcome will be. And if we can extend that kindness to the animals who share our world, I believe we can create something beautiful." The room erupted into applause, and John stepped down from the podium, his heart full. By early summer, the first annual Angel Bear Festival was in full swing. The town streets were lined with booths promoting conservation, storytelling sessions, and wildlife education. Margaret Chen, the general store owner, had baked bar-shaped cookies, and children from the wildlife club ran a booth on how to coexist peacefully with bears. JN was reluctant to participate at first, worried the festival might draw unwanted attention to Maya and her cubs, but as he wandered through the event, watching children learn about kindness and respect for nature, he felt Margaret's words echo in his heart as the sunset and the festival's energy began to wane. John found himself sitting quietly on a bench near the forest's edge. The distant sound of laughter and music floated through the air, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He gazed into the trees, wondering if Maya was out there watching from the shadows. Then, as if answering his unspoken question, he heard the faint rustling of leaves. His breath caught as Maya emerged from the forest, her now teenage cubs trailing behind her. She stopped at a respectful distance, her dark eyes meeting his. "Well, look who decided to join the party," John said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. Maya moved closer, her cubs following suit. She paused at the foot of his bench and dropped something from her mouth onto the ground, a branch heavy with fresh berries. John chuckled, his eyes glistening. "You never stop surprising me, girl." For a moment they simply sat together, man and bear, sharing the quiet understanding that had grown between them over the seasons. The festival's noise seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. Dr. Bennett, who had been quietly observing From afar later described the moment as a glimpse into something profound, a bridge between species built on trust, respect, and the simplest act of kindness. As summer deepened, Johan continued to share his story with anyone who would listen, hoping to inspire the same compassion that Maya had shown. He knew their bond was rare, but the lessons it carried were universal. One evening, as the stars filled the sky, John wrote in his journal, "Margaret always said that kindness was the pebble that starts the ripples. What I've seen, hear what Maya has taught me, it's more than I ever imagined. Those ripples have reached places I'll never see and touched lives I'll never know, and that's the most beautiful part of all." He closed the journal, a sense of peace washing over him. Somewhere in the forest, Maya and her cubs roamed freely, carrying with them the legacy of a man who had chosen kindness and the bear who had returned it in kind. As the days stretched into weeks, the Angel Bear Festival became a cherished memory for the small mountain community. The stories shared, the lessons learned, and the changes inspired continued to ripple outward. But for John Garrett, the most precious moments were those that came quietly, unannounced, in the form of visits from Maya and her growing cubs. One evening, as the summer sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Johan sat on his porch with Margaret's photograph in his lap. The warmth of the day lingered in the air, and the forest buzzed with the soft sounds of nature settling in for the night. "Maggie," he said, softly tracing the outline of her smile with a weathered finger, "you'd love this place. It's like the mountains are alive with your spirit." A faint rustling drew his attention. John looked up to see Maya emerging from the tree line. Her cubs, now nearly grown, followed closely, their movements graceful but still tinged with youthful playfulness. John set the photo aside and rose slowly, his heart lifting at the sight. "Well, hello there," he greeted. "It's been a while." Maya approached with deliberate steps, stopping just shy of the porch. She chuffed softly, her familiar sound of acknowledgement, and dropped a small pine branch at his feet. Her cubs followed suit, each placing a small gift, a cluster of berries, and a shiny stone on the porch steps. John chuckled, his voice thick with emotion. "You spoil me, you know." That he lowered himself to sit on the top step, careful not to startle the bears. Maya's cubs hesitated, but eventually moved closer, their curiosity outweighing their caution. One of them nudged the pine branch toward him, and John reached out to take it, marveling at their gentle confidence. "You've taught them well, girl," he said, addressing Maya. "They've got your heart." Maya sat down, her massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. Her dark eyes met John's, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. It was a moment of understanding, a connection that defied words, bridging the divide between man and beast. As the seasons changed, so did the forest. Autumn returned, painting the mountains in vibrant shades of amber and gold. The bears' visits grew less frequent as Maya and her cubs began their journey deeper into the wilderness, preparing for the coming winter. John knew this was how it had to be. Maya's cubs were nearly grown, ready to venture out on their own. He could see it in their movements, the way they lingered at the edge of the forest, hesitant but resolute. One crisp morning, as John sipped his coffee on the porch, he spotted Maya standing just beyond the tree line. This time she was alone. Her cubs had likely begun their solitary lives, as was the way of black bears. Maya approached slowly, her steps measured, her fur graying slightly around the muzzle. "You're looking good, girl," John said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. Maya stopped a few feet from the porch, her gaze fixed on him. She made a low chuffing sound, and then did something that took John by surprise. She stepped forward and gently pressed her forehead against his knee. John froze, the weight of the moment overwhelming him. He reached down, his hand trembling, and rested it on her head. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "For everything." They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, man and bear, bound by a decade of trust and kindness. Then, as if sensing it was time, Maya stepped back. She looked at him one last time before turning and disappearing into the forest. John sat there long after she was gone, the warmth of her touch lingering. He felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude, knowing that their bond, though rare, had left an indelible mark on his life. In the months that followed, John devoted himself to sharing Maya's story. He spoke at schools, community events, and even in conservation conferences, emphasizing the lessons of coexistence and compassion. The Angel Bear Wildlife Sanctuary, funded in part by the festival and donations inspired by the story, became a model for wildlife conservation across the state. Dr. Grace Bennett, whose research on Maya had garnered international attention, frequently visited John's cabin. Together they worked on educational programs and wildlife-friendly initiatives, ensuring that the lessons Maya had taught would continue for generations. One snowy morning, as John wrote in his journal, he heard a familiar sound outside, a soft chuffing that brought a smile to his face. He stepped onto the porch to see a young black bear, not Maya, but one of her descendants, standing at the edge of the clearing. It carried a small branch in its mouth, a gesture unmistakably inherited from its lineage. John chuckled, his breath visible in the cold air. "You've been paying attention, haven't you?" The bear placed the branch on the porch and retreated into the woods, leaving John with a renewed sense of connection. He picked up the branch and added it to the growing collection of gifts he kept in a small box by the hearth, a testament to the bonds that had formed and the legacy that continued. That evening, as the fire crackled and snow fell softly outside, John wrote in his journal, "Maya may be gone, but her spirit lives on in her cubs. In this community, in the hearts of those who choose kindness." Margaret always said love creates ripples that never end, and now I know she was right. The angel bear didn't just save lives, she changed them, and in doing so she reminded us all of the simple truth: kindness is the bridge that connects us, no matter how different we may seem. John closed the journal and placed it beside Margaret's photo. Outside, the forest was quiet, but John knew it was alive with stories yet to be told, ripples yet to be felt, and in his heart he carried the certainty that the bonds forged in kindness would endure far beyond his lifetime. And so the legacy of John and the angel bear lives on, a testament to the power of kindness, the bonds we can build across even the greatest divides, and the ripples of compassion that continue to inspire us all. This is more than just a story, it's a reminder that our smallest actions can create the biggest changes. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the beauty of compassion and connection, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us for more inspiring tales like this. Thank you for watching, and remember, kindness always finds its way back to you.